The man drove along his driveway as he felt something sharp punched his tires. With a sharp sound, 3 tires, $30,000 of damage, and one smirking neighbor hiding in the shadows. But what she didn't know was that she had just made the biggest mistake ever to cross Marcus Johnson. As we dive into the story, if you stand against injustice and prejudice, tell us where you are watching from and click on the subscribe button. Only those who support injustice won't subscribe. This story all started when Marcus Johnson became the first black homeowner in Highland Gates' 60-year history. In the quiet, well-manicured streets of Highland Gates, where million-dollar homes stand tall and proud, a new face had arrived. A face that would soon shake the very foundation of this community. Marcus Johnson's sleek Tesla rolled smoothly into his brand-new driveway at 11 p.m., the hum of the electric car barely breaking the stillness of the night. Everything was perfect, just as it should be for a 35-year-old corporate attorney who had worked tirelessly to get to this point. Marcus Johnson had worked his entire life for the success he now enjoyed. At 35, he was a well-established corporate attorney, sharp, intelligent, and determined. The dream had always been clear in his mind, owning a home in an upscale neighborhood where he could finally enjoy the fruits of his labor. Now, standing before his brand-new $1.2 million home in the exclusive Highland Gates community, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. But he also knew that it wasn't just a home he had earned. This was something that many like him had been denied for far too long. He was the first black homeowner in this affluent, mostly white neighborhood. And though the exterior might look like paradise, Marcus knew it wasn't going to be easy. "I've worked hard for this," Marcus would often say to himself. "This neighborhood is supposed to be welcoming, but I've always known I'd have to work twice as hard to prove my place here." Every corner of the house, every polished surface, was a testament to how far he had come. But just as Marcus was beginning to savor his achievement, the undercurrent of judgment in Highland Gates made its presence known. It started small. Whispers from neighbors, the kind of glances people give when something feels out of place. It wasn't overt hostility, but there was something unmistakable in the way the community treated him. Like they didn't fully accept him. The first hint came when he had his landscaping done differently than the pristine uniform lawns that everyone else had, the vibrant colors that popped against the grass. That's when Patricia Wheeler, a fixture in the neighborhood and the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, for the past 15 years, made her first move. Patricia Wheeler, a woman in her 50s, had lived in Highland Gates for decades. Recently divorced, she was now free to focus her energy on what she deemed was her real passion, preserving the standards of the neighborhood. Her controlling nature made her the self-appointed enforcer of everything she believed the neighborhood should represent, and when Marcus arrived, she saw him as a threat to everything she held dear. "I don't care who you are. If you don't follow the rules, you don't belong here," Patricia would often say, her eyes narrowing at anything that wasn't up to her expectations. From the very beginning, Patricia made sure Marcus would feel unwelcome. First came the anonymous complaints. His landscaping was unprofessional. Then came accusations about noise violations, which Patricia spread to other neighbors. Rumors that Marcus was throwing loud parties every night when he was working late. Marcus wasn't the kind of man to entertain parties or make noise. He was focused on his career, his work, his future. But none of that mattered to Patricia. She had already begun her campaign to make his life difficult. She even sent out complaints about his parking. There was always something she could point to. Something she could use to make him feel like he didn't belong. And the neighbors, many of whom were too afraid or too passive to confront Patricia, started to look at Marcus suspiciously, just as she had hoped. They had no idea who he was or the battles he had fought to get where he was. But Patricia had already done her job. "Have you seen the way he parks his car?" she would whisper to other residents. "It just doesn't belong in this neighborhood." At first, Marcus didn't think much of it. He was busy adjusting to his new life, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. The whispers in the neighborhood started to feel like a burden, and the more he observed, the more he realized that Patricia's influence over the community ran deeper than he had initially thought. People were beginning to avoid him, making little comments here and there. It was subtle, but it was there, and he felt it every time he stepped out of his house. Soon enough, Marcus realized he needed to protect himself, to document what was happening before it escalated. He was no stranger to the importance of evidence, and so he installed security cameras around his property, hoping to capture anything that might prove Patricia's harassment. He kept meticulous records of every interaction, every false complaint, and slowly he began to build a case, not just against Patricia, but against a system that had long tolerated people like her, using their power to control and intimidate others. Marcus remained calm, but inside, he was beginning to feel the weight of everything Patricia was throwing at him. But he wasn't one to back down. He would play her game, but he would play it on his terms. And the more Patricia tried to sabotage him, the more determined he became. The breaking point came when Marcus won the Best Maintained Property Award in the neighborhood. His lawn, his garden, and his house had been impeccably kept, despite Patricia's best efforts to undermine him. The residents, at least those not under Patricia's influence, recognized his hard work. But Patricia? She wasn't pleased. In fact, she had a public meltdown at the HOA meeting when Marcus was called up to accept the award. Her frustration was palpable, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. She couldn't believe it. This man, who she had been trying to run out of the community, had just been rewarded for the one thing she believed only people like her should have the right to enjoy. As Patricia seethed, Marcus stood tall, his expression unshaken. He knew this wouldn't be the end of it. This was just the beginning. And that's when it happened. The next step in Patricia's quest for control would be something Marcus never expected. A calculated, malicious act meant to remind him exactly who was in charge. At 11 p.m., as Marcus rolled his Tesla into his driveway, ready to enjoy the peace of his hard-earned home, the Tesla glided smoothly onto the driveway, its purring engine the only sound breaking the silence. But as soon as he stepped out of the car, the sharp, sudden sound of popping tires filled the air. Marcus froze. He turned slowly to see his tires shredded, each one violently punctured by something sharp. His heart sank as he took in the damage. The expensive tires, the pride of his new car, were destroyed. It was no accident. This wasn't a flat caused by debris or wear and tear. This was intentional. His tires were punctured, destroyed. His heart sank, but not out of fear. No, this was rage. If you were in Marcus's shoes, what would you have done at this point? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Like and subscribe now to enjoy more of these stories. As Marcus stood there, staring at the footage, something inside him snapped. This was no longer about landscaping or noise violations. This was personal. Patricia had gone too far, and she was about to find out just how wrong she was. At this point, it became clear that the stakes had been raised. Patricia wasn't just trying to run him out of the neighborhood. She was willing to go to any length to destroy him. The first thing Marcus did was not panic, but analyze. He had learned over the years that when you're attacked, you don't react in haste. You gather the facts. Using his security footage, Marcus sat down in front of his computer and began to sift through the recorded footage. The video played back, and as he fast-forwarded through the clips, he saw her. Patricia Wheeler, the woman who had been the architect of every obstacle he had faced in this neighborhood, walked right into view of the camera. She was the one who had set the road spikes. The images were clear. She was out there in the dead of night, under the cover of darkness, with a smug, satisfied look on her face as she walked off, leaving the scene of her crime. But Marcus wasn't just going to sit back and let Patricia get away with this. He had been patient, yes, but now it was time to strike back. Armed with evidence, he reached out to a few civil rights attorneys, hoping to get legal support for his case. He knew this fight wouldn't be easy, and Patricia would use every trick she had to bury the truth. But Marcus was determined. He wasn't going to let one woman's racism and entitlement destroy his home and his life. If they want to fight, I'll give them one they'll never forget, Marcus said, his voice calm but determined as he spoke with his attorney. He had documentation, the security footage, and witnesses, and now he had a legal strategy. This wasn't just about tires or property damage anymore. This was about standing up for what was right. It was about holding people like Patricia accountable for using their power and privilege to intimidate and harm others. Marcus began the long process of gathering community support, reaching out to neighbors who might have witnessed Patricia's harassment or been victims of it themselves. He began talking to people, opening their eyes to the truth, making sure they knew that they weren't alone. He knew Patricia had built a wall of fear around herself, but he was about to break it down, one brick at a time. Every conversation, every meeting with his attorney, every piece of evidence Marcus gathered was like a step closer to bringing Patricia down. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a personal crusade to not only seek justice for himself, but to make sure no one else would ever have to suffer at Patricia's hands again. And as Marcus sat in his living room reviewing the evidence once again, he made a vow to himself. This would not be the end of his story. It was just the beginning of the fight that would change everything for Highland Gates. Just when Marcus thought he had a handle on the situation, just when he thought he was starting to get the upper hand against Patricia Wheeler, everything he knew about his fight took on a completely different meaning. The shocking revelations that followed would not only shake the very foundation of his battle, but would also reveal hidden truths about who Patricia Wheeler really was, and why she was so dangerous. For the past several years, Marcus had served as a prosecutor specializing in hate crimes. His experience with the law was extensive. He knew how to build cases, how to gather evidence, and most importantly, how to expose the hidden truths that people like Patricia desperately tried to keep buried. He wasn't just battling Patricia's abuse of power. He was armed with the skills and knowledge to fight the deep-seated systems of inequality that had allowed people like her to thrive in the first place. But Patricia had made a grave mistake in underestimating Marcus. While she thought she was simply dealing with a successful attorney who was too busy for confrontation, she was actually facing someone who had dedicated his life to taking down corrupt systems. Systems just like the HOA she controlled. He had a history of bringing discriminatory HOA boards to their knees. And this time, it would be no different. Marcus wasn't just fighting back against a bitter, entitled woman. He was fighting for the future of his home, his community, and anyone else who had ever been silenced or marginalized by people like Patricia. As Marcus dug deeper into the case, uncovering evidence piece by piece, he was about to expose Patricia Wheeler for something much more sinister than anyone had suspected. It wasn't just her bigoted behavior toward him. It was her long history of targeting minorities. She had been doing this for years, in other neighborhoods, under different names, in communities just like Highland Gates, and every time, she had gotten away with it. Patricia had made it a point to push out those who didn't fit her ideal image of what a neighborhood should be. A neighborhood that, in her mind, was white, wealthy, and conforming. Marcus wasn't the first person she had gone after. As he connected the dots, he uncovered previous lawsuits filed against Patricia from people who had also been victimized by her racially motivated tactics. He found complaints from families who had been discriminated against, pushed out of neighborhoods for no reason other than their race or background. But what really disturbed Marcus was the pattern. A consistent history of using her power within the HOA to target minorities. It was a strategy. She's done this before, Marcus said quietly to himself. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead in disbelief. I just didn't think she'd do it here. It became clear to Marcus that this wasn't just about a few misplaced complaints or her attempt to push him out of the community. This was part of a long-standing effort to maintain the dominance of a certain type of person in the neighborhood. Patricia wasn't just an angry, petty woman. She was a woman whose financial troubles had driven her to extremes. When Marcus dug into her financial background, he discovered that her divorce had left her struggling, trying to hold on to the power she had held for so long. She needed control, and she needed money. And Marcus, standing in her way, had become the perfect target. But she hadn't counted on one thing. Marcus wasn't going to back down. As the truth began to unravel, Marcus's resolve only strengthened. He was no longer fighting just for his own home. He was fighting to expose the depth of Patricia's hatred and to bring her actions to light. She had spent years manipulating the system, hiding behind her position of power, and now she was about to face the consequences. Marcus was no longer just a man trying to protect his property. He was a prosecutor, a fighter for justice, a champion of the oppressed, and he was going to make sure Patricia's reign of terror came to an end. With the full weight of his legal expertise, his personal connections, and his community support, he was preparing for the battle of his life. And it would be a battle Patricia would lose. With every piece of evidence he uncovered, Marcus had a clearer picture of who Patricia really was. But the most important discovery was yet to come, the revelation that Patricia had underestimated him in every possible way. She had thought she could use her power to manipulate the HOA, but Marcus had spent his career taking down people just like her. It all came down to this moment. The moment Marcus had been preparing for. The moment that would either solidify his place in Highland Gates or tear everything down around him. As the HOA emergency meeting began, Marcus sat at the front, his folder of evidence placed in front of him. The weight of everything he had discovered hanging heavily in the air. The residents, the very people who had either been complicit or too afraid to speak up, were now about to hear the truth. They had no idea how deep the corruption went, no idea just how much Patricia Wheeler had been hiding. But Marcus was ready to lay it all bare. He wasn't just there to defend his home anymore. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the entire community. He had evidence, hard, irrefutable evidence, that Patricia had been using her power for years to target minorities, to harass anyone who didn't fit her ideal image of what the neighborhood should look like. And now it was time to make her pay for everything she had done. You think you can get away with this just because you've been in charge for years? Not anymore, Marcus said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension in the room. Patricia's face flushed with anger, her smug expression faltering as the room turned its attention to her. She had ruled Highland Gates with an iron fist for far too long, but now for the first time she had no control. The truth had finally come out, and Marcus wasn't backing down. As he began to lay out the evidence, the room fell silent. Security footage, witness testimonies, financial records, each piece connected the dots, telling a story that Patricia could no longer deny. The lies she had told about Marcus, about the others she had targeted, were exposed for what they were: manipulations, half-truths, and outright fabrications. One by one, other residents began to speak out, sharing their own experiences of Patricia's harassment, the small ways she had tried to push them out of the neighborhood, the ways she had used her position to tear apart families and communities. The floodgates had opened. "We knew something was off," one neighbor spoke up, their voice trembling with emotion, "but we never had the courage to say anything. We didn't know how deep it went." Another resident added, "Patricia always had a way of making people feel small, of making us doubt ourselves. But Marcus, he gave us a voice." The room shifted, the energy changing. The once silent neighbors were now coming forward, standing with Marcus, showing their support in a way they never thought they could. Marcus felt a rush of vindication wash over him, but he knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning of what he had planned for Patricia. She wasn't going to just walk away from this, not when her actions had caused so much harm. Patricia, once so confident in her power, now found herself backed into a corner. As Marcus presented more and more evidence, her eyes shifted nervously. She had always believed she was untouchable. After all, she had been the HOA president for 15 years. She had orchestrated everything from the shadows, pulling the strings, getting her way with every complaint, every violation, every neighborhood rule. But now, her reign was ending. "This is ridiculous," Patricia finally said, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "You don't know what you're talking about. I've been here for years, and I've always done what's best for this community." Her eyes darted to the other residents, hoping someone would come to her defense, but no one did. The room remained silent, and all eyes were on her, waiting for her to face the consequences of her actions. Marcus stepped forward, his expression hard. "You've crossed the line, Patricia," he said, his voice unwavering. "And now it's time to pay the price." The words hung in the air as the HOA board members, who had once been too afraid to challenge Patricia, began to murmur among themselves. It was clear to everyone in the room that Patricia's hold over the neighborhood was over. No longer would her deceitful tactics go unchecked. Marcus had taken the fight to her doorstep, and now she would be forced to face the consequences of her actions. The legal consequences were quick to follow. The evidence against Patricia was irrefutable. Criminal charges for property damage and civil rights violations were filed, and the proceedings to remove her from the HOA board began almost immediately. No longer could Patricia hide behind her position of power. No longer could she manipulate the neighborhood with her lies. It was over. She had been exposed. What do you think should be the consequence of Patricia's actions? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to click the subscribe button now. The weight of the charges settled on her shoulders, but she was still defiant. "This is a mistake," Patricia muttered, her voice barely audible now. "You can't do this to me." But Marcus had made sure of it. He had built a case that was too strong to ignore, too powerful to dismiss. This wasn't about a few road spikes or false accusations. This was about the years of injustice she had caused. It was about finally holding someone accountable for their actions. And just like that, Patricia's empire crumbled. As the meeting wrapped up, the sense of relief in the room was palpable. Marcus had done it. He had fought for his home, for the truth, and for the community that had been silenced for far too long. The neighborhood was about to change for the better, and Patricia's days of running the show were over. The new leadership of the HOA was committed to fairness and inclusion, and the residents who had once been too scared to speak up were now united in a common cause to ensure that this never happened again. Marcus looked around the room at the neighbors who had finally found their voice. They were no longer just passive residents. They were a community, and together They would rebuild what Patricia had torn apart. As he walked out of the meeting room, he couldn't help but smile. This fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, everyone who had ever been silenced by the bully in the neighborhood. Marcus had won, and in doing so, he had shown everyone that justice, no matter how long it takes, always prevails. The day Patricia had worked so hard to avoid was finally here. Her reign of control, her grip over Highland Gates had slipped beyond her reach. The once powerful HOA president was now facing the consequences of her actions. Patricia Wheeler was arrested. The moment that seemed impossible just weeks before had arrived. Her arrest was a symbolic turning point, a clear message that no one, no matter their position, could get away with racism, manipulation, and deceit. The evidence Marcus had gathered, the support of the community, and the legal system had all come together in a way that was undeniable. Patricia's wrongdoings, the road spikes, the racially motivated harassment, the fabricated violations, had been laid bare for the world to see. And now, Patricia was no longer in control. "This is just the beginning of a better neighborhood," Marcus said, his voice filled with determination. As the community witnessed Patricia's arrest, it became clear that change was underway. Highland Gates, a place once ruled by fear and exclusion, was about to transform into a place of unity, fairness, and belonging. The old guard, led by Patricia, was being replaced by new leadership, people who believed in fairness and inclusivity, people who wanted to build a community based on respect rather than division. Marcus stood on the steps of his home, watching as the authorities led Patricia away. For a moment, it felt surreal. This woman had tormented him, tried to run him out of his own neighborhood, but here she was, held accountable for her actions. It was a moment of triumph, but also a moment of realization. Justice had been served, but the work wasn't over. Patricia's arrest marked the end of one chapter, but the beginning of a new one for the neighborhood. Marcus knew that simply removing Patricia from power wouldn't be enough. The community needed to heal. It needed to rebuild the trust that had been broken, to reestablish the sense of unity that Patricia had shattered with her toxic influence. So Marcus did what he had always done. He took action. The HOA leadership was overhauled, and with that came a new wave of leaders. People who valued diversity, who believed that every resident, no matter their background, should have a voice in the community. The changes didn't happen overnight, but they began with Marcus. He became a figure of change, someone people turned to when they needed guidance, someone who could bring people together when the lines had been drawn so sharply. Marcus pushed for diversity initiatives that would reflect the true values of Highland Gates. He encouraged the formation of a community watch program, ensuring that no one would ever again feel the kind of isolation and fear he had experienced under Patricia's leadership. As Marcus worked tirelessly to implement his vision for the future, he became more than just a neighbor. He became a leader in the truest sense of the word. Highland Gates was no longer just a place on the map. It was becoming a symbol of what could happen when a community came together to fight for what was right. "This is our home," Marcus said, his voice filled with passion, "and it's time to make it a place for everyone." Those words resonated throughout the neighborhood, echoing in the hearts of the people who had once felt too afraid to speak out, too afraid to act. With Marcus at the forefront, Highland Gates began to transform. The community watch program Marcus advocated for became a powerful tool, not just for safety, but for unity. It brought the neighbors together in ways they had never experienced before. People started to see each other not as strangers, but as members of a shared community, bound by a common goal, to build a place where everyone belonged. The transformation wasn't just about policy changes. It was about the people. As new leadership stepped in and started making changes, the community responded. They showed up to meetings. They participated in neighborhood events. They worked together to ensure that Highland Gates would never again become a place of division. The transformation was slow, yes, but it was also inevitable. With Marcus leading the charge, the sense of camaraderie that once felt impossible began to take root. In the months that followed, the neighborhood began to flourish. There were community gatherings where people of all backgrounds came together to celebrate their shared love for their home. There were cultural exchanges that celebrated diversity, where families who had once been ostracized were now included and embraced. The HOA meetings became places of open dialogue, with every voice heard, no longer dominated by fear and exclusion. The old Highland Gates, once a community torn by fear and hostility, had been reborn. And at the heart of it all was Marcus, his dedication, his courage, and his unwavering belief in justice. He had fought for his home, but in doing so, he had fought for all of them. And as Marcus looked around at the neighborhood he had helped rebuild, he couldn't help but smile. This was what he had worked for. This was the future he had hoped for. One where every neighbor had a place, and where no one would ever again feel like they didn't belong. If you enjoyed this story, like and click the subscribe button to enjoy more of these stories. See you in the next video.